The first tool that we're going to talk about in Advanced Excel is the pivot table. A pivot table allows you to combine and compare large amounts of data in an interactive report. Emphasis on the interactive. You can choose to view different summaries of the source data as well as get detailed information on specific areas of interest. You can use the pivot tables when you want to analyze related totals or be able to switch between the summary type data and the detailed data for a large data set. Now, for the examples we're going to be using during this video recording, we're mostly going to be using smaller sample sizes, but traditionally when you use a pivot table or chart, you have a large amount of data. If you are following from home on the Twinsburg Public Library class website, you have access to the Advanced Excel worksheet. You can download it and follow along in this video if you like. We are going to be using the filtering tab to get started with pivot tables. So make sure the filtering tab is selected and make sure your insert ribbon is displayed. Over on the very far end under the tables group, you're going to see pivot table. This is the command that we're going to use to start the automatic walkthrough, or what they would call the wizard when you're talking about Microsoft Office. So with pivot tables, you're going to select your data, and if your data has labels included, you do want to add those. So for example, we have name, gender, age, sport. This is a class list with students who play certain sports. We want to include row 1, name, gender, age, sport, into our data selection. That way we can actually use the labels when we organize and manipulate the data in the pivot table. So select your data, click Pivot Table, and this will start the Pivot Table wizard. This is the Create Pivot Table pop-up box. Make sure that the Select Table or Range is selected and that it's showing the data that you selected. Notice it shows the Filtering tab and A1 through D31. You can also look on your spreadsheet and you'll see a moving green line surrounding the active set of data. So this is the data I want to work with. Next I have to choose where I want my pivot table report to be placed. I can either put it inside of an existing worksheet, or I can select New Worksheet and put the pivot table on its own sheet. This is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to click OK. At the very bottom you'll see it says Sheet 1. Well, this isn't very helpful to us, so I'm going to rename this by right-clicking over the Sheet tab, choosing Rename, and I'm going to give it the name of Practice Pivot. So now I'm working in the Practice Pivot spreadsheet. So if anytime you see that the Pivot Table Fields box is vanished, all you have to do is click onto the Pivot Table area right here, and it will appear. Notice that we see name, gender, age, and sport. These are the labels that we had in the data that we selected. So these are the pivot table fields. We can close it up by clicking X. We can change these settings by, for example, how we want it to appear. We can change it like this if we prefer to look at the data sets in columns, but I'm just going to keep it by the default, which is this style. Notice that when you move your cursor over your data sets, they turn into, your cursor turns into a four-sided arrow. This lets you know that you can actually move this piece somewhere else. So if I click and drag name, I can drop it into one of these other areas. This is what makes the pivot table very interactive. We can move our data into different fields. I'm going to include all four by checking it, and notice that it just pops up here in a line. This isn't very helpful. This just shows me my student's name, their gender, sport, and age, and it's not much else that we can do. So what we're going to do is uncheck these, and we're actually going to use the fields. When you move your cursor over the data set, you'll notice a drop down arrow. If you click on that, This lets you select or deselect certain aspects. So if we don't want the baseball players included, we can take them out before we even move them into the pivot table. You have your filters, columns, rows, and values. Let's go ahead and we're going to move the sport into the column section. Notice that now I have columns of baseball, soccer, softball, and automatically a grand total is included. I now am going to add the age into the rows. Now in my row area I have 11, 12, 13, 14, my ages. Here we see values. If I move name into values, watch what happens. The pivot table counts those values for me. So even though my names are text, Excel knows to count each instance of text as a one instance of data. So here under baseball, I have 3 11-year-olds in baseball. I have 5 11-year-olds in soccer. I have 2 13-year-olds in softball. I also have the grand total of my baseball players, my soccer players, and softball. So I have 30 students total of those sports. So again, pivot tables are very interactive, so I can remove a field over here on the right side and I can change it. So maybe I'll put gender into columns. So now I can see my males and my females. So I have 4 11-year-old females and I have 3 13-year-old males. There is 1 14-year-old female. If I remove the count of names, I can replace age into values. I can replace name into rows. So here I see the name of the students, and I see if they are male or female, and their ages. Notice that the grand total adds up the ages. Well, this isn't very helpful because this isn't actually accurate or what I'm looking for. So just keep in mind how the pivot table works. It's very great for quickly identifying certain patterns within your data, and it's very interactive. I can change any field I want, but I have to really know what my data is, and I have to know what it is I'm after. So what is the pattern I'm looking for? What is the goal of the pivot table? And that I have to figure out before I actually design my pivot table. So that's the gist of it. You're going to select your data, click on the pivot table, and just start clicking and dragging into the fields that you might need to evaluate your data. These fields are going to change based off the type of data you're working with and, again, what your goals are. One more thing I want to mention. Anytime in Excel, if you see the drop-down box, this allows you to filter your data, including data within a pivot table. So if you click on the drop-down box, you can deselect certain data that you might not want included, click OK, and that will exclude that set of data. Again, click on the drop-down box and select the data that only you want included, click OK. When you see the little filtered symbols, that means your data is currently being filtered. You can click on it again to select all and include all sets.